on today's World Insight with Jian Wei. Setting the record straight after the U.S. Vice President's policy speech on China. What's the real score? And the United Nations in action. Choice interviews with movers of the World Organization. And here's our host, Jian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live on CGTN from Beijing. U.S. Vice President Mike Pence has delivered another speech on China-U.S. relations. His speech a year ago was heavily criticized by Beijing and helped sour relations as the trade war intensified between the two countries. This year, however, with negotiations on a potential trade deal, at least phase one of the trade deal, Mr. Pence took a more, apparently, conciliatory tone. The question now is whether that change in tone leads to a change in substance. Before our discussion, take a look at what he said.
Being a hawk on China is politically fashionable in Washington these days, and U.S. Vice President Mike Pence rolled up Thursday at this glitzy hotel in Washington to address the U.S. foreign policy establishment on U.S.-China policy. With a potential trade deal looming and an upcoming face-to-face meeting between President Xi Jinping and President Donald Trump, the U.S. Vice President took a more conciliatory tone from last October.
People sometimes ask whether the Trump administration seeks to decouple from China. The answer is a resounding no. Well, thank you all for that warm welcome.
While extending an olive branch on trade, Pence did criticize China, accusing Beijing also of religious persecution and intrusive surveillance.
China has spent great efforts to protect its human rights. The most important standard on which to judge the human rights of China comes from the satisfaction of the Chinese people. China also firmly safeguards its national sovereignty, security, and development interests. Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Xinjiang are all China's internal affairs, which other countries cannot interfere in.
Pence continued to use the word rival to describe China and describe Beijing's military growth as a threat. But at the same time, he reaffirmed the One China policy with regards to Taiwan. He also talked about strengthening bonds between the two nations in education and other areas of cooperation.
So, real takeaway from the U.S. Vice President's words about China and the U.S.-China relations. Let's turn to our panelists in Philadelphia. We have Naisa Mahboobi, a research scholar at the Center for Study of Contemporary China from the University of Pennsylvania. Welcome to our program. Also, in our Beijing studio, Liu Baocheng, Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics from the University of International Business and Economics. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Professor Liu, no decouple, apparently, from the Vice President between China and the United States. Are you surprised?
Well, I'm surprised Pence really made that remark and made a strong no, because he has been piercing China for so long a time now. I really congratulate him. At least on this point, he is really landing on the reality that it is indispensable that both of the nations, in many ways, not only in terms of economic cooperation, technology cooperation, people to people, etc., it is impossible to decouple. And I believe if the U.S., as he claimed as a democracy, people won't really vote for a decoupling.
Okay, well, we don't know whether there's going to be a national survey and whether the results of the national survey can be trusted in that regard, looking at the past elections in the U.S. But Mr. Mahboobi, your take about the so-called decouple or not decouple, change of tone, change of degree, we don't know. What's your take?
So my first point is just to say that I agree that the speech was more conciliatory than I think a lot of us were expecting. There was certainly content in there that was similar to Vice President Pence's speech from last October at the Hudson Institute, but there was also this new language, including the language about no decoupling and other language as well in terms of engagement, a constructive relationship that does seem to signal the softening of the administration's position. I think it's right to focus on that rather than the other language that is more or less a kind of a conventional type of language in D.C., but this new language is I think, more noteworthy. Decoupling is a very complicated concept. I think decoupling can mean different things to different people, and so I think that's part of the problem. I think sometimes with decoupling, you can be talking about supply chains, or maybe you can be talking about technology, or maybe you could be talking about other kinds of exchanges. Right. And so the general resounding no in the speech obviously makes a difference, but we would have to get into the weeds of specifically what are we talking about.
That's a very good point, because that's my next question, Mr. Mahboubi. If I could go to you once again. We see that so-called not to decouple between the two countries combined with so-called strategic rival. All of these phrases are up to interpretation to different people, to politicians at different times. We all know they could be interpreted in so many different ways and can throw out at any time they want. So, Mr. Mahboubi, at this point, what about a combination of these two? Not decouple, but strategic rival. How would you interpret that?
So I don't envy the people in China who are in the foreign policy think tanks or in the government who are supposed to try to read the signals from the U.S., because there's a lot of different signals from a lot of different actors. I would focus especially on technology right now as an area of confrontation. I think there continues to be a robust debate. The New York Times had a piece the other day about how there continues to be a robust debate within the administration over technology and export controls. So that could be an area where you're going to continue to see more tension and potentially more quote-unquote decoupling. But, this language from Vice President Pence is important. It's important that the Vice President would say this at this particular time, and we'll have to kind of see now whether that changes things on the ground in terms of the different aspects of tension.
Talking about technology, Professor Liu, the first thing jumped to my mind, of course, is 5G. Now, for example, Chinese company Huawei, or the multinational company Huawei, based in China, already offered to sell 5G technology to the U.S. companies if they want. Now we haven't got much heard back from any of the players from the other side of the Pacific. So, Professor Liu, when you say a decouple, what kind of things are we looking at? Chinese multinational companies like Huawei are offering some say an olive branch. On the other hand, U.S. multinational companies also, technology-wise, need to operate in China as well. They want the Chinese market. So, what about that decoupling? To what extent, Professor?
Well, technology is not really as mysterious as people thought about, because it is really a result of investment, and it is now translated into a commodity that can be sold, and through licensing, through franchising, through technology transfer. Yes, it must be on voluntary basis. So now I think Huawei presented a very good question that, okay, I'm ready to sell. You guys budget about 5G. Okay, let's talk about the price. Let's talk about collaboration terms. So right now, all technologies are so much interwoven, and it requires large capital input. And without really collaboration, without the market for the exchange of technology, you do not really have the right capital to improve on it, so that a large part of the whole globe can really benefit from it.
That really put us to another question, Mr. Mahboubi. We also heard the Vice President Pence in his speech criticize once and again multinational companies coming from the United States taking advantage of the U.S. interest in a way and trying to cater to the other markets, China particularly, as its priority. Mr. Mahboubi, how should we understand the relations between, let's just say, the operations of multinational companies of U.S. right now and the politics now in Washington? Will two sides listen to one another, or they are just going to keep on blaming one another while at the same time seeking political safety?
So, I think there's a lot there, and the best way I can answer is this. So the first thing to underscore is that the environment in Washington certainly is much more confrontational towards China, much more interested in highlighting differences in terms of approaches and values and the like. So multinational corporations are now operating in an environment where there's sensitivities both in terms of Beijing and in Washington, and they have to navigate it as best as they can. In the case of the NBA, personally, I think that some of the criticism in the U.S. vis-a-vis the initial hesitance to back up this Rockets general manager was actually valid. I think that was good criticism within the U.S. I do think, though, that the fact that the vice president is picking on the NBA in the speech is maybe indicative of a larger culture war environment that we have in the U.S., because there are many other corporations that one could make the same kind of argument about. But I think in terms of the takeaway point for your audience is to say that, yes, there is this greater sensitivity in the U.S. now over the issues that divide the U.S. and China in terms of values and approaches. And U.S. multinational corporations are going to have to navigate both sides. They can't simply take into account Chinese sensitivities. They also have to take into account American sensitivities. That's going to be very complicated.
Business is caught in between. That's the problem here, right? I mean, over the past few months and maybe a year's time, you have seen already tariffs, and Professor Liu, having an impact on Chinese and American companies alike because of the way the trade works. American companies usually produce in China and then sell it to global market, the U.S. market included. So how do you see the relation between the business world, particularly the multinational companies, which is still the backbone of the U.S. economy, many argue, and also the U.S. politics for now?
Well, let's go back to Adam Smith, who
really? Can we go back that long?
Yeah,
okay, go ahead.
Yeah,
sir.
who says that those who claim that they love their country among the business people, they are lying. So, you know, business people...
So you are brushing off the so-called patriotism of businesses alike in the world.
Exactly. You know, capital, who is represented by business people, they are like water. They go to wherever you can really, you know, derive a better profit. So therefore, by cornering those, you know, companies to go back to the States or to bash China, that's a mission impossible. And of course, you know, it caused the damage on both sides, and companies will have to spend a lot more money, you know, to relocate a portion of the operation outside China in order to avoid the tariff that is imposed. But you know, given the competitive advantage of the Chinese industrial cluster and given the humongous amount of skilled labor available, it is impossible to drive them away totally from China.
But you know, well, gentlemen, when we look at the speech, it's just a politician who delivers a speech. So how much trust you put into a politician, particularly his words, is always questionable, isn't it? Having said that, though, how much of it, Mr. Mahboubi, would you say this is more political rhetoric for now? Given the politics going on between the two parties and the impeachment and all these struggling before the election, how much of it is really about the U.S. national interest and a well-crafted national vision and strategy toward China? Mr. Mahboubi.
So I would say you're right that this is a very complicated political picture in the U.S. right now, and there's a lot of moving parts, and so coming up with a very clean, simple narrative will be hard to do. I don't think, and I think many other people have made this criticism of the Trump administration, I do not think the Trump administration has an overall coherent strategic vision vis-a-vis China. I think they have a lot of different people pushing a lot of different agendas that often are in conflict with one another. And I think sometimes Chinese audiences don't see that. They don't see that there is actually a lack of a coherent strategic vision. All of that said, I do think that the vice president's more conciliatory language was important. It does reflect that the Trump administration, and I think also the Chinese as well, are trying to lower the temperature on some of the rhetoric around the trade war and around the larger confrontation. This is not to say that it's going to resolve all those issues. I think we are going to be in a new era of, quote unquote, in the words of the national security strategy, great power competition. There will be lots of areas of tension. That said, this is important that he used this more conciliatory language, and I think he's driving towards a deal, hopefully, in November between Trump and Xi that would at least resolve some initial things, but then maybe with a view towards more constructive engagement going forward as well.
Well, after your American counterpart, Professor Liu, you only have 45 seconds rather, to finish the answer. Leading up to APEC, from now till then, phase one, much to be expected?
Yeah, I think, you know, the tonality has been set forth, and also the initial or at least partial agreement has been done. The only risk is that we do not really repeat what has done before, you know, when a big part has been great, and then later on it turned out, both sides are finger pointing each other to backtrack on their promises.
So what can we expect?
I think one is the intensive communication before the final version is being agreed upon, and the other is that mutual consultation on the narratives, so that which is utterly important to avoid a repetition of the previous mistakes.
Well, we are looking forward to Chile, to the APEC leaders meeting. From now until then, a lot of things could happen, but let's wait and see. What can I say? Thank you so much to all of you, gentlemen, for joining us and sharing your insights. And Nathan Mabubi from the U.S., Liu Baocheng from China. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Have a great weekend, gentlemen.